Hashemi. I'm currently the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver. It's a huge honor to have David Kirkpatrick with us today. David has been a staff writer for The New Yorker since December of 2022. For the previous 22 years, he worked as a reporter for The New York Times in New York, Washington, Cairo, and London. While at the Times, he shared 3 Pulitzer Prizes for international reporting, national reporting, and public service. He was the Cairo bureau chief for The New York Times from 2010 to 2015, where he led coverage of the Arab Spring uprisings. I want to thank David specifically for the time that he spent in the region covering the Arab Spring. I want to thank him for his professionalism, his courage, his integrity, and for the risks that he took. The late Robert Fisk used to say that journalists write the first draft of history, and the fact that we had a really competent and qualified journalist on the ground in the region writing that first draft of history is a huge benefit to all of us who then try and analyze it and interpret it. So thank you, David, immensely for the risk that you took. The Economist named his book about the Arab Spring, which was titled Into the Hands for the Soldiers, Freedom and Chaos in Egypt and the Middle East, as one of the best books published in 2018, and I can't agree more with that assessment. In a recent issue of The New Yorker, the April 3rd issue, which I actually have here with me, David has a very long and important essay called The Dirty Secrets of a Smear Campaign. I encourage you all to read it. If you don't have a copy of that, email me. I'd gladly share with you my copy. My first thought when I read this story is this has to be turned into a Hollywood movie or a Netflix 8-part series, because it's a thriller.
From your mouth to God's ears, Scott.
Right. Well, you never know what might happen. But it's a story of, not just a story about a tragedy of an innocent person who was really victimized, but it's also a story about the politics of our contemporary world. The research, the attention to detail is worthy, in my view, of another Pulitzer Prize. David and I are going to have a conversation, starting off with the story that he wrote in The New Yorker, and then we want to focus on how this story relates to the core themes of this conference, the core themes of the Arab Spring, the question of authoritarianism, democracy, citizens' rights, etc. I'm assuming that most people have not read this story, so I'm going to begin by asking David to take a few minutes to give us the broad picture, the summary of this very important essay that you've written that's called on the front page of The New Yorker, The Smear Campaign Industry.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for that too gracious introduction. So let me just tell you the story of my story. So the protagonist is a person named Hazem Nada. He's an American passport holder of Egyptian descent, and he finds himself living in Como, Switzerland, right near the Italian border. And he happens to be the son of an early and important Muslim brother, Yusuf Nada, who became an expatriate, an exile from Egypt. But Hazem, the son, is Western born and bred and really doesn't have that much interest in his native country, or his father's native country, Egypt, and he's not that interested in the Muslim Brotherhood either. In fact, he's, he seems, in my casual impression, sort of medium religious and not in any way political. He succeeds tremendously. He's a very bright guy, got a PhD in applied math from Imperial College, studied physics at Cambridge. He's a very bright guy. He's running a thriving oil trading company. He's becoming very rich by trading oil around the world, until all of a sudden, a few years ago, these rumors start to pop up, allegations start to pop up on the internet, suggesting that he's somehow tied to terrorism, bringing up his father's history with the Muslim Brotherhood as grounds for accusing him of terrorism. These allegations appear to snowball out of nowhere. Suddenly banks won't lend to him. They're turning him away. His enterprise, trading oil, is heavily dependent on that kind of financing. It goes bankrupt. So his vast fortune is largely crushed, and his life is destroyed. In the depths of his despair, he receives an odd phone call or text message on Signal, and the message says effectively, "Hello, I am a hacker. I have hacked into some files that can reveal to you who has destroyed your company and why? He says, well, I'm interested, of course, and he hears more, and it turns out that this group of hackers, who initially style themselves as kind of vigilante activists, but actually are looking to get paid, these hackers have cracked into the computer system of a Swiss private investigator, Mario Brero, who is considered the sort of pope of Swiss private investigators. There are a lot of Swiss private investigators. Geneva, Switzerland turns out to be a sort of hotbed of intrigue. I didn't realize that. Anyway, this gentleman, if I can call him that, Mario Brero, turns out to have accepted a long-term assignment from the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates has hired this Swiss private investigator to go after its perceived enemies across Europe, across Western Europe. That is, people that the United Arab Emirates associates with Qatar, their regional rival, or the Muslim Brotherhood, or who eventually are just prominent people critical of the United Arab Emirates, like members of the UN panel of experts on Yemen. So Hazem begins to deal with these hackers, and they welcome him into this trove of documents that they've stolen from the internal computer systems of Mario Brero, which obviously is a crime and morally, the whole enterprise is morally ambiguous. The hackers, I initially thought, as some of you may now be thinking, well, I'll bet these hackers are working for Qatar, you know, the UAE's regional rival. But no, in this case, the hackers want Hazem to use his connections in the region through his father and the oil trading business to try to help them sell this cache of documents for the really big score to Qatar. So Hazem is sort of dragooned, enlisted into playing the role of emissary and carrying the message for these hackers to Doha that they would like to get paid for all these things. And that drags on and on and on for years, or months, maybe a year. And while he's running these errands, he delves into the documents and he sees that at the behest of the United Arab Emirates, they have paid this private investigator lavishly to systematically destroy his company, to capitalize on latent or not so latent Islamophobia in the West, to sort of smear him as a terrorist just because of who his father was or what his religion is. And that Brero has persuaded them to do this. Really, it seems for his own self-enrichment, right? That he has this deep-pocketed client on the hook, and then it's in his interest to try to upsell them, to persuade them that there are even more enemies across Western Europe than you suspected. That you know, the Muslim Brotherhood and Qatar's allies are in fact everywhere, and you need to pay me, Mario Brero, a great deal to help you stamp them out wherever they are found. And in fact, not only is Hazem not a Brotherhood-linked terrorist, as Brero puts forth, he begins to sell the UAE on the idea that quite a few Muslim civil society groups across Europe are also somehow linked to the Muslim Brotherhood or terrorism. Largest among them, I think, Islamic Relief. That one really stuck out to me because ultimately, at the end of the day, this is a humanitarian organization. You know, they're heavily audited, and all the money that they raise goes to helping people who are in the most acute need around the world. So that the UAE, with its ample resources, is commissioning this Swiss private investigator to try to damage Islamic Relief was striking to me, and yet that's what they did. So that is the story that I told, culminating in Hazem's. Eventually, he gives up on selling these documents to the Qataris, and he reaches some other agreement with the hackers so that he can get possession of them, give them to me, and then seek a kind of a lawsuit to try to recover some of his losses. How did I do that?
That's good. That's good. So one of, I think, the important themes that comes out in your essay is really the role of authoritarian regimes, autocratic regimes, in sort of, you know, damaging the integrity and the reputation of innocent civilians. In this case, you know, an American citizen. And so, you know, what I liked about your article is it sort of confirms an argument that I've been articulating for a very long time, that, you know, yes, authoritarian regimes, as we saw in the first panel, are responsible for destabilizing the Middle East. But now there's a bigger problem, that these authoritarian regimes are also, in very pernicious ways, undermining our own democracy here in the West, here in the United States. And you end your essay with actually quoting from one of my professors at the University of Toronto, Ron Diebert, who is the director of this very important citizen research lab. And I just want to read the quote for everyone. So Professor Ron Diebert, writing in the Journal of Democracy, says, quote, "Anyone with enough cash these days can hire a private Mossad. Subversion is now big business. As it spreads, so too do the authoritarian practices and the culture of impunity that go with it." So could you give us some context to this particular quote and connect it to the essay and the story that you tell about Hazem and his particular play? Because I think this is really one of the key lessons that I took away from your article that matters for our contemporary world and its relationship to the themes of this conference, this idea of private intelligence, authoritarian regimes, and then the threats to democracy for citizens here in the West.
Sure. I mean, when I moved to Cairo in 2010 as the New York Times correspondent there, I was fairly naive about the way that that region operated and the U.S. alliance with many of its supposed clients operated. And the Arab Spring and its aftermath was really eye-opening to me because several countries that style themselves, that I'd understood to be close partners and allies of the U.S., the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, foremost among them, actively tried to subvert U.S. policy in the region, really determinedly, with a lot of money, with systematic propaganda campaigns against the U.S., against U.S. personnel in the region, against the U.S. ambassador in the region, by lobbying very adroitly and effectively inside the halls of the Pentagon and the White House. They really campaigned against what the U.S. was its stated objectives, what the U.S. said was its stated objectives, which at the time was the support for democracy. And you know, they obviously, some would say they were pushing on an open door, but they won, right? They won in the region, they won in U.S. policy. Since that time, there has been a lot of evidence that some of these same countries, and not only these countries, you know, also their rivals. I mean, I should say, when I say a lot of evidence, the nature of subversion, right, or behind-the-scenes lobbying, or this sort of private spying it's designed not to be seen by me or any of us. So when we do get a glimpse of it, it's happenstance, it's chance. And yet, nonetheless, we've seen a lot of it. Most of what we've seen has to do with the UAE, and to a certain extent Saudi Arabia, but also Qatar and Turkey. And it seems that these countries are working hard to try to influence, often covertly, the machinery of American democracy in their favor, which, when you think about it, makes sense. I mean, suppose you are a very, very wealthy authoritarian state, and you are completely and utterly dependent. Your political system is quite closed, but you're completely and utterly dependent for your existence and protection on a much larger state, the United States, with a very open, even porous, possibly too porous political system. So what do? Do you try to influence it covertly or otherwise? Of course, you owe it to your family. If not, you know, you're probably a monarch and you're thinking about your family, to try to do that, and that's what they have done. And so since the time when I moved back from Cairo, it's been a kind of recurring theme in my coverage, as you've seen examples like George Nader, who was an Emirati operative who tried to wend his way into the Hillary Clinton campaign, and then when that bombed out the Trump operation, the overtures to Tom Barrack, who was Trump's close friend. On the other side, you know, we've seen the Qataris, or people very close to the Qataris, manage to hack into the computer systems of Ambassador Otaiba, here working for the United Arab Emirates in Washington, or Elliot Broidy, you know, a businessman close to Trump who happened to have some interests in the region as well. We've seen Turkey also getting into the game with its various efforts to support the Hulk Bank, its work with General Flynn, its kind of behind-the-scenes overtures to Jared Kushner, building connections with President Trump's family in order to influence him and have a distorting effect on U.S. policy in Syria, arguably. And so you begin to think, with friends like these, who needs enemies? And that seems to be the context to me of that quote from Professor Giebert. Am I making any sense?
Yeah, you are. You have to read the article to really sort of get, I think, the point that you're making. But it makes perfect sense. Which then raises the big issue that I think is very much front and center of American politics today, is the problem of foreign interference into our political system, corrupting our democracy, buying off our politicians, and fundamentally undermining the very sort of just society that we like to think that we're striving for. So the question then becomes, how do we prevent this type of thing from happening in the future? It's happening. We know the Russians have done it. We know other countries are doing it. But you shone a good spotlight on how these authoritarian regimes, who claim to be our allies, and we would expect that at least they respect the laws of the land, are, I think, taking advantage of loopholes to sort of, to insert themselves into these types of debates, fundamentally affecting the lives of innocent people, innocent Americans who need to be protected or should be protected by their government. So do you have any thoughts on how we prevent this problem from getting worse? Because it's pretty bad right now, and unless there are policy changes, I can see this just getting worse in the coming years.
Well, there are certainly people in Washington of the sort of common cause variety who would say the problem is that American democracy is sort of self-subverting, right? That we have campaign finance problems and internal corruption, and we have our own problems. And if were we to shore those up and insulate our politics from interests, then that would solve the problem. That's not going to happen in the short term. What it seems to me is this situation where we form these partnerships and close alliances with authoritarian states are a special problem, a unique problem for influence on American democracy. For a couple of reasons. If you're a hostile authoritarian government like China or Russia, it's very difficult for you to say, hire a gazillion former American government officials so that they, when they're doing their jobs, are thinking about their future payday working for you. It's very difficult for you to lobby or hire lobbyists or set up your own interest groups. It's very difficult for you to have your ambassadors strolling through the halls of the Pentagon or schmoozing people in the White House. But if you're a nominal ally, that's not the case. It's easy for you. It's built into your job, almost. It's built into the structure of that relationship. Now, you might say, well, are all allies a problem like this? No, they're not a problem like this. When you're dealing with a democratic ally or an ally with a more or less open political system, like the Norwegians or something, they don't, for their own reasons, they're not going to find it convenient to try to covertly influence American democracy. It would be exposed internally in their country. It's just not something that those governments do. But governments which, unlike us, don't even pay lip service to the idea of representative government and open democracy, not only is it natural for them to try to subvert American democracy, it's inevitable. They can't even help it. That's what they do. And so when you form alliances with authoritarian governments, and I've been careful to include a broad spectrum, right? The Saudi Arabians, who my friend Sarah Lee just mentioned, are paying this enormous check to Jared Kushner, and who were showing up with the Trump administration just as they were in office, offering to spend all kinds of money to try to help them politically. So the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, the Turks, across the spectrum, everybody's kind of playing this game. So when you form these alliances with authoritarian governments, it's not like the authoritarianism, you're not going to catch it like a cold, but it does seem to rub off a little bit. It's not great for your democratic practices at home. And maybe none of these countries in their efforts have actually changed American foreign policy. And yet their efforts have to breed a kind of cynicism, and may on the margins, when you look back in particular on the deliberations within the Obama administration about the Arab Spring, I think many people would say that Ambassador Taiba and the UAE was very effective at influencing American policy.
Yeah, I think it's in Obama's memoir where this is one of the reasons why they effectively backed the coup in Egypt in 2013, was out of deference to their allies in the Gulf. They didn't want to upset the Emiratis, the Saudis, who were really upset about the Arab Spring, and that was a factor that weighed heavily on Obama's thinking in terms of how to respond to the coup.
I don't think you put it quite that baldly.
No, that's my spin on it, but it was a sense that, look, these are the factors that we have to sort of think about, and we have these allies who we don't want to upset our relations. We're
That's not a comprehensive list of the regional allies who had strong feelings about that either, but we can move on.
Right, but I recall sort of that being, something that Obama was, thinking about and weighed heavily on his conscience. And again, remember the timing. This was when the Iran nuclear negotiations were taking place. These countries were upset with Obama for engaging in those talks, and this was sort of a way of saying, look, we'll lean in your direction on the Arab Spring sort of coup d'etat if you sort of give us some leeway on the Iran nuclear talks. So these I think speak to the deeper, longer term problems that go with having these types of authoritarian allies. I think they lead to bad policy. But getting back to the domestic side, I mean, my gut reaction after reading your article is the only way we can prevent this type of sort of corruption from infecting the American democratic system and preventing former American government officials after they retire to becoming lobbyists for very good salaries from these authoritarian governments is having ironclad, very strong laws that prevent this type of thing from happening. And unless we do that, our democracy is just going to be continually eroded by these relationships that we have and very lax laws. In many ways, at the end of the day, it's us. We're responsible for our own, getting our own house in order. And it seems to be there is a lot of talk about fixing this type of foreign interference, but not a lot of action. Do you have any thoughts on concrete things that we can be doing? It's not just about the Gulf states. Other countries are doing this as well. But since we're talking about the Middle East here, the question is, what type of policies do we really need here to protect our own democracy from this type of subversion?
Well, there's a whole bundle of good government reforms to try to decrease the influence of lobbyists or the influence of interest groups, the influence of money in politics. And that's a little bit over my head. But I think before you get there, it would help to just introduce a greater degree of skepticism into the American public and the American political class and the American foreign policy apparatus of our authoritarian allies. I mean, as a journalist covering the Arab Spring, I was astonished by how much foreign policy thinking about the Middle East is haunted by the Iranian Revolution. And back then, Gene Kirkpatrick, with whom I'm no relation, wrote an influential essay called Dictatorship and Double Standards, more or less faulting the Carter administration for undermining the Shah by yammering on about human rights. And so there was this constant invocation of the Iranian Revolution, like, look, if we endorse these uprisings against these authoritarians who have been our allies, what if it's like Iran? What if it's replaced with someone we like even less? And I hovering over this, I think Jean Kirkpatrick might even have alluded to this line, but it's the summary of her essay. He may be a bastard, but he's our bastard. And what I wish that people would understand is he's never our bastard, right? This local authoritarian who we think that we are cultivating because he is on our side or will be our ally, he never is, because he always has a self-interest which will come ahead of our interests. The war in Ukraine has been a real manifest lesson in this. Around the region, all of our sort of, he's our bastard, but he's a bastard, but he's our bastard guys have equivocated or sided with Russia. Right? So here's a foreign policy issue about which the US government manifestly cares enormously. And we hear tapes leak that the Egyptians are contemplating selling weapons to Russia. We know that the Egyptians have been playing games with Russia in Russia's efforts to interfere in Libya against American interests and are generally building closer and closer ties to Russia despite the war in Ukraine. The UAE has become sort of the #1 forum for sanctions evasion. And the Saudis have flaunted their continued alliance with Russia and even moved ahead with military training for their own forces inside of Russia. So these countries whose alliance we prize, we might say, well, okay, they're an ugly authoritarian, but they're on our side. They're not really on our side, and they're structurally not on our side because they're always more interested in their own self-preservation. And if we kept that in mind, then we would be less likely to, as I say, let their ambassadors uniquely stroll through the corridors of the Pentagon.
Yeah, especially at key moments like this when we would expect our so-called allies to be on our side with respect to the question in Ukraine, as you just said. Many of them are more or less quasi-allied with Putin, really, in his sort of policy toward Ukraine than he is with ours, which raises the big question: what are we getting? What's the return on our investment when it comes to these autocratic regimes? To say nothing about the point that you mentioned in your article, how the new sort of added concern about this alliance that we have with these autocratic regimes is they are undermining our own democratic norms back at home, which is just another layer of concern, which hopefully would get people to sort of have the type of reevaluation and rethinking about our support for autocratic regimes under the mantra that they preserve stability and they pursue our interests. And the more you look at it, the more that argument is more difficult to sustain. Which then sort of, gets us back to your article. One of the things that I loved about your article was all of these sort of overlapping themes, not just authoritarian regimes and the mayhem that they create, how they hurt innocent people, how they undermine our own interests and our own democratic values. But you also talk about how, and you mentioned this in your earlier comment, how the theme of European Islamophobia was central to the ability of these authoritarian regimes to, to go after this character, Hazem
Right, and after many of these other, Muslim civil society organizations across Europe that they found a community to target, like Islamic Relief. Yeah, it's an odd thing, because these authoritarian governments we're talking about happen to be Muslim majority governments,
right?
And yet they are trafficking in Islamophobic tropes at best in their efforts to try to bring down their perceived enemies in the West.
Right. Just highlighting what I've argued, that there's just no ethical sort of focus here. It's just really narrow, hardball politics that they're playing to pursue their own narrow interests in regime survival and regime perpetuation. So I really liked the article. It was really wonderful. I encourage everyone to read it. You end the article by sort of suggesting that the story's not over, that the key character who's been victimized here is pursuing some legal action against the United Arab Emirates for what they did to him. Do you have a sort of a postscript that you could share with us in terms of what might be happening next?
I know he's working on it, but I don't have any update that I can share at this time.
Okay, so something to watch for in terms of our coverage. Hopefully you'll write about it if it doesn't make any news. So let's turn to the audience now and sort of get them to sort of perhaps ask you some questions, either about the article or about some of the themes we're talking about, or even if you're open to this, some of your reporting during the Arab Spring, which was really stellar and outstanding. So the floor is open. I see Ravon at the microphone. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
I've been standing in line because
Sorry, I didn't know. I
I have a question that I'm dying to.
Please.
I'm dying to ask.
Please.
It's about. First of all, thank you very much, David, for coming to our conference and for your presentation. Wonderful presentation. Yes, I mean, these interference from foreign powers is not easy to get rid of or to stop. But if anything, we are a country of rule of law, and there is a law against supporting coups in other countries and supporting governments after coups in other countries. There is a law. And yet, you were in Egypt when the coup happened in 2013, and recently, a more recent coup happened in Tunisia. And the US really did not stop supporting these regimes after the coup. That's illegal. Why doesn't the legal system or our political system work together work to apply the rule of law, which is that we do not support a government after a military coup or after any coup against democracy? Why can't we at least hold on to that, law and, force the government, force everybody to respect the law? I mean, you were in Egypt, that's why I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, right. In my book, I wrote extensively about the decision within the Obama administration not to call the coup in Egypt a coup.
Exactly.
Essentially, it was a coup. a certain level, your question is over my head. If you're asking why isn't the American government less cynical and more honest and transparent and ethical, that's definitely over my head. In point of fact, why did the Obama administration not call the coup a coup? It goes back to the things that we've been talking about. I mean, they were persuaded that their partnership with Egypt, and in particular their military partnership in Egypt, could be jeopardized if they called it a coup, and that was the paramount consideration. Their allies, as you mentioned, in the region were also strongly supporting support for the coup. You know, the hacking of Ambassador Otaiba's emails revealed that he sent several pointed and threatening messages to his close friends in the National Security Council that day, warning the U.S. that if it didn't get on the bandwagon, it would face a kind of backlash in the region. That was his pitch. So that was going on as well. And the earlier panelists spoke in various ways about the fatalism or pathologizing of the Middle East, that these are, you know, the Orientalism, the sense that it's always been like this, etc. That was also clearly at work. I think there was a certain fatalism or pessimism baked into many of the thinking by many of the top policymakers. Certainly, Secretary of State Kerry and Secretary of Defense Hagel, who were key interlocutors with Egypt at the time and key players in policymaking in the White House. I think they both thought, look, as Kerry more or less put it to me, you know, Egypt has had these authoritarian military regimes for a long time. We've worked with them. Has it been perfect? No. Is it going to change? No. Which, again, that's a low expectation, and I think reflects some of the biases we've been talking about, and became a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, arguably. But all those things were work. So we had the military partnership, influence of allies, and this sort of soft Orientalism or Islamophobia, I think.
Sarah Leah?
Thank you, David. I wanted to ask you about your experience and observations from your time at the New York Times, but within the broader American media, and certainly from my perspective, the New York Times being among the best in the world in terms of the coverage of what's happening in the world. Do you observe, or have you observed, as I tend to observe, and whether you think it's misplaced, particularly among national security correspondents, correspondents who cover Washington, cover politics in Washington, the reverse almost, or the flip side of the pathologizing of the Middle East and of Arabs and Muslims, a pedestaling of America and the American government as fundamentally agents for good, fundamentally well-intentioned, democracy-promoting agenda. And do you see that pervading their coverage and their description of decision-making in Washington, as well as accepting claims of the US government as fact? So for years, we've been subject to the Iranian-backed Houthis from the first days of the war in Yemen, without ever even needing to proffer any evidence for that, but never once describing the Saudi government as the US-backed Saudi government, for example. Do you see that orientation in the reporting, or am I reading too much into it?
Your question is quite sprawling. On the general belief that the U.S. has an exceptional and noble role to play in the world, I don't think that's embraced by the New York Times. I'd refer that question to Shadi in the back there. We can speak to that later. In terms of whether the mainstream media, including the New York Times, is too credulous of the claims of the American government, I strongly don't think that's the case. I mean, just the day-to-day incentives in the lives of American journalists is that if you can embarrass the American government, you get a gold star. If you can epically humiliate the American government, you win a Pulitzer Prize. All the incentives are towards skepticism, and that includes skepticism of designations of the antagonists in the Yemen conflict. I think you are factually mistaken if there was not skepticism in the New York Times applied to the Iranian relationship with the Houthis or the Saudi relationship with its preferred government, quote-unquote, government in Yemen. I mean, I was involved in some of that coverage, and there was a lot of skepticism, as there should be.
Next question.
Thank you very much, David. And so, in the discussion, and if I remember correctly in your article, it's been a little while since I read it, the framing was really one of foreign policy, understandably so. But you've made a nod a couple of times to this notion of Islamophobia being a catalyst. I think it might be the other way around. I think it's really, that's the core issue, and it's really a domestic policy story, and with a foreign policy chaser. So the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding here in DC recently did some work on banking while Muslim here in the US. So I'll kind of use that as an example. Islamic Relief USA has had a lot of issues, maintaining accounts and maintaining financial relations, but even LaunchGood, which is the CEO of LaunchGood is a white convert, right? So it's just this notion of being kind of somewhat related to Muslim-y things that kind of gets you into trouble. And so if you'll just indulge me, I'll just give you an analogy. It seems that, like Muslim organizations are trying to kind of grow down the river, and they kind of have, like a hole. They have a leak, right? And they're trying to kind of get some water out of there. And it seems like these foreign, entities are just looking at that and maybe just kind of throwing a couple more cups of water in there. The core issue is that you have this leak. The core issue is that you have this kind of domestic policy that needs to be addressed. That's my perspective. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a catalyst. I just heard the panelists this morning bring up again and again in various terms, the Orientalism or the pathologizing of the region, and that squares with my opinion that that's going on, right? There is this weird thing that you encounter as an American journalist when you're talking about your reporting. People will, or come back talking with people who I think of as sophisticated, educated liberals who would never knowingly indulge in anything that might be labeled bigotry, and they would say, what happened to the Arab Spring? Was the problem Islam? And I just think, what? Do you know what I mean? It's just such a false dichotomy. Like, one of these things is a religion and the other is a form of government. And by the way, you would be humiliated to say that about any other religion. Like, you substitute Buddhism or Hinduism or Judaism in that sentence, and you would be laughed out of the room. And yet people say it with a straight face. So I don't know what causes this, and I'm not sure it's a policy problem, and I would love to know the solution, but it's definitely a thing.
Next question.
Thank you for your journalism. You made a comment about the motive that authoritarian Middle Eastern countries have in undermining, to do this kind of activity, in undermining their perceived enemies in the West. Isn't there also a role played by their attempt to undermine their actual or perceived rivals in their own lands? After all, it was a Muslim Brotherhood established party that won the election in Egypt.
I thought it went without saying that an authoritarian government does not like its domestic dissidents and is the enemy of free speech. I thought that's the table stakes for the conversation.
Okay, we're getting close to the end, so we have 3 people standing up. If I can just ask no one else to join the line so we can get to the questions and some answers. Go ahead.
Thank you. It's true, authoritarian regimes are trying to influence, and these examples that you mentioned are amazing actually for UAE and Qatar. But let me take this back here. In 1971, we had the Epsilberg, the Pentagon Papers, where we basically split the information about the Vietnam War in our own way. We had WikiLeaks. We have just lately the Pegasus files. Then we have the Twitter files, where we know that every agency here in this government is trying to influence and spin the information right and left. And then, it is the idea that the authoritarian regime are doing it is not only them. Are we doing the same thing? Let me give you the last example. In 2003, 2 members of AIPAC were caught red-handed, basically getting classified information from here, the United States, to Israel to influence our policy in Iran. And then what happened? The Department of Justice dropped all charges against these two people. And they were spying on us. So, is it the issue, is it really UAE, Qatar, or it's really the new colonial approach to meddling with other people? Thank you.
I find your question sort of going in a couple of directions.
I was going to ask you for a little bit more clarification on exactly what
Well,
your
I
question
can
is.
just take it in 2 parts. You mentioned an Israeli example that seems to fall in the same basket as my examples, right? Foreign countries trying to influence U.S. policy. In that case, there was some some police action to try to deter it. Your other part of your question seemed to be about whether the U.S. government, in the Cold War era, there were lots of examples of the U.S. government trying to covertly influence other governments. Some of them became scandals here, and I think those are less often done now, because we do have still, knock on wood, a free press and a fairly open political process, so that when if the CIA were to try to set up a bogus newspaper and spin bogus ideas in some foreign country for the idea of influencing its politics, chances are that would come out eventually. And the fact, there's an internal deterrent to doing too much of that. It makes the US and other open governments less inclined to do that and less good at it, as much as they might try.
Go ahead.
This is a brief observation to maybe try to make a connection between the general point you're making and the Tunisian situation. I've heard from many people in the Gulf, in the Emirates, in Qatar and Saudi, that when Yusuf al-Qaradawi dies, which he now has, it's going to be a question of who's going to be the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood and the spiritual leader of the Muslim world. And what I hear very frequently there, it's going to be Ghanouchi. I don't particularly find that convincing, but I am reasonably convinced that a fair number of people think that's the case. So I wonder what you think of that, and does that help us to think about where Tunisia fits into this connection of what people in what regimes in the Gulf are doing to influence the environment in which they live?
I think the arrest of Sheikh Ghanouchi is a tragedy because of the importance of his ideas far beyond Tunisia. I wish more people would be paying attention to events in Tunisia. I don't particularly want to participate in a conversation about who is going to be the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Muslim world or political Islam. I just think that set of ideas is, that whole conversation is problematic. And again, we wouldn't have it about another religion. Like, the thing about religions is they're multiple and various, and their meaning is always contested, and that's the good news. So I don't think that Qaradawi was a very effective broadcaster and a smart theologian, I guess, for the people who care about those things. But I don't think he was unique in the world, and I don't think he's going to be replaced. I mean, it's just the nature of any religion, including my own, is it's a constant debate about its own meaning, and that's going to continue.
The question is not, is that, I think that's perfectly an example. The question is, do people in the Gulf who are making policy, do they think that's the case, and does it influence their policy?
Well, I think if, the Gulf states really, they don't like elections, and they don't like democracy, and they don't like the idea that political Islam could be associated with elections. And for that reason, I can only imagine that Sheikh Ghanouchi was uniquely objectionable to many of the Gulf states.
Last question, Dan.
Yeah, this is by way of an observation. I haven't read David's piece, and I'm getting on a plane for Tunis tonight and plan to make that my
You've got a lot to
mission
look forward to.
number one. Yeah, it's going to certainly increase my sense of pessimism, I suppose, in many ways. But I'm in the throes of writing a piece provisionally entitled Rethinking Global Autocracy, which is sort of a deep dive into the literature here, coming particularly out of the think tank community, which attributes processes of authoritarianism and autocratization chiefly to Russia and China. It's good to be reminded of the multiple sort of vectors that are promoting autocracy globally, and that's part of the critique. that I'm writing in response to the literature that's been put out by a lot of my colleagues. It's going to be interesting to see how this piece evolves. But I do want to say that we have just two words of kind of caution from my own sort of thinking about this, and it's been going on for months. I'm not finished, but I'm getting close to finish. And that is, number one, there's a complex relationship between the kinds of dynamics you're talking about, David, and the nature of any democracy, including the American democracy. And I get concerned when we hear words like subversion and so on, when I think that the key drivers of our democratic crisis are largely embedded in our own country. And these foreign effects exacerbate them. But there is a kind of notion out there that the so-called democratic malaise or backsliding is a consequence of international interventions and so on, particularly from the Russians and the Chinese. And we have to be really careful. It's a very complicated question analytically and conceptually and empirically. And the other observation is that there's an obsession in Washington with Chinese influence. That's all you hear about now. It's the number one existential threat. We hear it in the Congress. And the consequences for our own Chinese American citizens has been quite negative. Because it's not on the par with concern perhaps with Russian influence in the 50s, but there's a lot of kind of McCarthyism out there about sort of Chinese influence. And I just want to say it's just very disturbing. And it's become an obsession here in Washington. And while there is a lot of malign influence, that's the term almost always used, malign. First of all, the question of how it affects our democracy is complicated, but second of all, it's certainly overdrawn, I think, in so many ways, and really detracts from a lot of the other sort of influences. We had 4 years of an American president who did more to model autocracy than any American president in many years. So I just sort of a cautionary tale about sort of where and what kind of causes we try to draw in terms of our own democracy. Thanks.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I tried to say before, our own democracy is, as I said, self-subverting, right? We have our own, So I don't want to oversell the idea that foreign governments are I don't want to traffic in conspiracy theories. They're not. We can't attribute our own problems to others.
And I very much appreciate it.
Hidden hands.
Yeah, that's very important. Because now in D.C. we have this kind of obsession that is part of the policies of the think tank community. And so I recognize what you said, that it has to be repeated and amplified.
Yeah, I just want to end by emphasizing a fact that everyone knows, that the quality of any democracy is really dependent on a free press, but also investigative journalists who are willing to take risks, to pursue stories that illuminate some of these sort of, scandals and, unethical practices that authoritarian regimes are pursuing, in this case in the Middle East. And if it wasn't for your sort of real, commitment to pursuing investigative journalism, we wouldn't know about this particular story, David. So thank you very much for the work that you've done in the past on the Arab Spring. Thank you for this recent article in the New Yorker. I think we are better as a country because of journalists of your caliber. So thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nader and David, for really a very interesting dialogue and illuminating dialogue. And we've had, before that, a very also interesting panel. So we've had a very fruitful morning. Now it's time for lunch. We're going to move to the other room on the other side. Please try to move as quickly as you can because we're 10 minutes late. And we have a very busy afternoon with two very large panels, big panels, important panels. So we'd like to catch up on time. So please go back to the other room on the other side, and we will be starting shortly. Thank you.